There is a moment in this story where a mother called the police because she had not heard from her teenage daughter in days. The police went to the house. A young man answered the door. He was calm. He answered every question they asked him. He told them the girls had gone to the movies. The officers looked at him, decided he seemed reasonable, and left. The girls had not gone to the movies. They were already dead. They had been dead for 2 days. And the man, standing in the doorway, answering questions in that calm, measured voice, was the person who had killed them. The officers left, drove away. The man went back inside, and 24 hours later, police came back to that same house on First Avenue in Farmville, Virginia, and this time, they found what had been there all along. 4 bodies: a 16-year-old girl, her 18-year-old best friend, her mother, a university professor who spent her career teaching students about the human cost of violent crime, and her father, a Presbyterian minister who drove 4 hours to check on his daughter and never came home. The man who killed them had posted his confession online years before any of this happened. He set it to music. He uploaded it to MySpace for anyone who wanted to listen. He rapped about the best feeling he got from watching someone take their last breath. He described the act of killing in specific, detailed language and then put his name on it and made it public. Nobody called the police. Nobody thought he meant it. This is the story of Richard Samuel McCroskey III, known online as Syko Sam, and the 4 people who died in a quiet Virginia college town in September of 2009 because one girl met her internet boyfriend for the first time and felt nothing. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel is built around the stories that sit at the edges of what most people are willing to look at directly. The ones that make you uncomfortable, not because they are strange, but because they are not. Because they involve ordinary people making choices the rest of us convince ourselves we would have caught in time. If those stories matter to you, subscribe right now. It costs nothing, and it means these stories keep getting told. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened in Farmville, Virginia in September of 2009, you have to understand the world these young people were living in about 5 years before that. The internet in the mid-2000s was a specific kind of place, not what it is now, not the curated, algorithm-driven experience most people navigate today. It was messier, more anonymous, more intimate in certain ways precisely because it was less polished. MySpace was at the center of it for a particular subset of teenagers who were looking the way teenagers always look, for a community that understood them. And for a group of young people drawn to dark music, horror aesthetics, and the subculture built around those things, MySpace was where you found your people. Horrorcore was the music of that world. If you have never heard of it, horrorcore is a genre of hip-hop built around horror imagery. Lyrics about violence, death, mutilation, the occult. The beats are heavy and the words are deliberately disturbing. Artists who perform in this genre will tell you, and have always told you, that it is artistic expression, a way of exploring darkness through fiction, the same way horror movies explore darkness through film. Most of the people who make horrorcore music, and most of the people who listen to it, are not violent. They are drawn to the aesthetic of darkness the way millions of people are drawn to slasher films or crime fiction. The music is extreme. The people are usually not. Usually. Emma Niederbrock was 16 years old in 2009. She lived in Farmville, Virginia, with her mother, Dr. Deborah Kelly, a 53-year-old associate professor of sociology and criminal justice studies at Longwood University. Emma had been homeschooled since middle school. She was, by all accounts, bright and curious. A girl who had found her community online the way many teenagers of that era did, through shared music and shared aesthetics, and the particular kind of connection that forms between people who feel understood by strangers in ways they do not always feel understood by the people physically around them. Emma's best friend was Melanie Wells, 18 years old, from Inwood, West Virginia. The two had met through their shared love of horrorcore music and had built the kind of friendship that forms between people who speak the same language, who reference the same things and laugh at the same things and feel safe in the same spaces. Melanie had been staying at Emma's house that autumn. Emma's parents were divorced. Her father was the Reverend Mark Niederbrock, 50 years old, the pastor at Walker's Presbyterian Church in Hicksburg in Appomattox County. He had raised Emma with the kind of steady, present attention that people who knew him described with genuine warmth. He was, by every account that exists, a good man, an Eagle Scout, a graduate of the University of Illinois who had worked as a graphic designer before entering the ministry, a father who loved his daughter. And across the country, in Castro Valley, California, a 20-year-old named Richard Samuel McCroskey III was spending his evenings on MySpace. McCroskey was a graphic designer by training and an aspiring horrorcore rapper by ambition. He performed under the name Syko Sam. He had a MySpace page where he posted his music, tracks with names like My Dark Side and Sick in the Brain and Up in Flames. In his lyrics, he described the physical act of killing people with a specificity and a relish that should, in retrospect, have meant something. He rapped about the best feeling he got from watching someone take their last breath. He described stabbing and watching and waiting. He posted it publicly with his face on the page, with his real name attached to his profile. He had been talking to Emma Niederbrock online for approximately a year. In McCroskey's understanding of the situation, Emma was his girlfriend. They had spoken on the phone. They had exchanged messages. He had built an entire interior version of this relationship over the course of those months. Who she was to him, what they were to each other, what was going to happen when they finally met in person. Emma's understanding of the situation was different. She liked his music. She thought he was interesting online. Whether she understood the depth of what he believed their connection to be is something that the record does not make entirely clear. What is clear is that in September of 2009, Emma Niederbrock was excited to meet a person she had known online for a year, not the person McCroskey had decided she was to him, just someone she talked to on the internet. The difference between those two things was about to matter enormously. Richard McCroskey was, by the accounts of people who knew him offline, unremarkable. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He did graphic design. He was not the kind of person who commanded attention in a room. He did not have a history of violence or a criminal record of any kind. His sister, Sarah, told a television reporter after his arrest that she had been looking forward to his visit to Virginia, that she wanted to hear his voice, that she was worried about him. The person Sarah McCroskey described and the person who posted as Syko Sam online were, in the way that matters, the same person. The online version was not a mask over something innocent. It was an expression of something the offline version kept, contained. The internet gave the darkness a name and a venue and an audience. It gave it a stage. And on that stage, McCroskey had been performing with increasing specificity for years before anyone in Farmville had ever heard his name. He was not vague in his lyrics. He was not metaphorical. He did not wrap his content in the distanced language that horror artists typically use to signal the boundary between fantasy and intention. His songs were written in the first person, present tense, physical detail. He described sensation. He described preference. He described the pleasure of watching and waiting and the specific satisfaction of a particular act completed. This is the context in which Emma Niederbrock knew Richard McCroskey, not as a dangerous person, as a person in a community she belonged to, a fellow traveler in a shared musical world, someone interesting to talk to online. Someone whose music she listened to and whose page she followed and whose name she mentioned to her mother when she talked about the Michigan Festival. She had no reason to read his lyrics as a warning. Neither did anyone else. On September 12, 2009, Emma Niederbrock and Melanie Wells attended a horrorcore music festival called Strictly for the Wicked in Southgate, Michigan. Emma's mother, Deborah Kelly, drove them there. Emma's father, Mark Niederbrock, also made the trip. This was the kind of parent support that speaks to who these people were. Parents who showed up for the things their children cared about, even when those things were outside their own comfort zones. A criminology professor and a Presbyterian minister at a horrorcore music festival because their daughter wanted to be there. Because they wanted to be with her. Richard McCroskey was at that festival. He had traveled from California to attend, and the primary reason he had traveled from California was that Emma was going to be there. This was going to be the first time they met in person. For McCroskey, in his version of events, this was a significant moment. A relationship moving from online to real. Something he had been building toward for a year. Emma saw him at the festival. Something shifted immediately. The person standing in front of her was not the person she had been imagining. The dynamic was not what she had expected. Whatever connection had felt real across a screen and a phone line felt different in a parking lot in Michigan. Emma was underwhelmed and made no serious effort to hide it. She spent the festival with her friends. She was warm with McCroskey in the way you are warm with someone you know but are not especially close to. She was not his girlfriend. She had never been his girlfriend. McCroskey understood this at some point during that day in Michigan. He did not process it the way most people process rejection. He did not feel the particular sting of a hoped-for thing not working out and then go home and recalibrate. He did not tell himself it would be fine, or that he had misread the situation, or that these things happen. He stayed close to Emma and Melanie for the rest of the day, and after the festival ended, he traveled back to Farmville, Virginia, with the group. He was allowed to stay at the Kelly house. Nobody knew what he had decided in Michigan. Farmville is the kind of town that looks like safety. It sits in central Virginia, home to Longwood University, and the surrounding rhythm of a college town. Students on bikes, local restaurants, the comfortable noise of a community that does not expect violence. The house on First Avenue was a family home, a professor's home, the kind of place with books on shelves and students who had been invited to cookouts and a spare room that a young man from California could stay in for a few days while he figured out his return trip. Between September 12th and September 16th, the record of exactly what happened inside that house is incomplete. What investigators and prosecutors later established through evidence and McCroskey's eventual guilty plea is a sequence of events that the police occult expert brought in to examine the scene described, in the only 2 words he apparently needed, as a slaughterhouse. Deborah Kelly was killed first, then Emma, then Melanie. All 3 died from blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon was a maul, a heavy splitting tool somewhere between a hammer and an axe. The crime scene was so disturbing that law enforcement officials who spoke publicly about the case in its immediate aftermath declined to describe it. The police chief of Farmville was asked at a press conference to characterize what investigators had found. He said the victims died of blunt force trauma and said nothing further. He was a man who had seen crime scenes before. He chose not to describe this one. What is documented about those days between the festival and the discovery of the bodies is fragmentary in the way that the interior of a crime is always fragmentary. The physical evidence is there, the timeline is reconstructed, but the specific texture of what those hours felt like inside that house, what was said, what was not said, how the ordinary business of a household continued around something that had already been decided, is not available to us. What is available is the shape of it. McCroskey had traveled across the country to confirm something he had believed for a year. When the confirmation did not come, when Emma stood in that parking lot in Michigan and was simply herself rather than the person he had assembled in his imagination from a year of phone calls and messages, he did not revise the belief. He carried it with him back to Virginia, into the house, into the days that followed the festival. There is a particular psychology here that investigators and criminal behavior experts have examined in cases that follow similar patterns. The person who constructs a detailed interior relationship with someone who does not share that construction is not simply deluded about one thing. They have organized a significant portion of their emotional world around an idea of another person. When that idea is confronted with reality, the confrontation is not experienced as a disappointment. It is experienced as a theft, as something being taken away that was rightfully theirs. The response is not grief or embarrassment or the ordinary recalibration of expectations. It is something colder and more certain than any of those things. McCroskey spent 5 days in that house after the festival. For most of those 5 days, 3 people did not know they were in danger. McCroskey remained in the house. For 2 days after killing 3 people, he stayed. He answered the phone when Melanie's mother called, looking for her daughter. He gave different stories each time. She went shopping, she went to see friends, she was at the movies. He stayed calm. He cleaned himself up. He moved through the space with the composed practicality of someone who had made a decision and was now managing its consequences. And then Mark Niederbrock drove to Farmville to check on his daughter. He had not been able to reach Emma. He had not been able to reach Deborah. He drove 4 hours because his daughter was not answering and something felt wrong. He knocked on the door of the house on 1st Avenue on September 17th. McCroskey let him in. Mark Niederbrock did not leave that house. Here is what was happening simultaneously on the outside of that house while the bodies were inside. Melanie Wells's mother had been calling for days. She had not heard from her daughter. She was worried. She contacted the Farmville Police Department and asked them to check on Melanie at the Kelly address. Officers went to the house. McCroskey answered the door. He was calm. He answered their questions. He told them the girls had gone to the movies and would be back later. The officers looked at him and found nothing alarming about what they saw. They had no reason to enter, no warrant, no evidence of a crime beyond a mother's worry and an unanswered phone. They left. Melanie's mother called again. Police went back to the house a second time. Still no answer. Still McCroskey at the door. Still the girls at the movies. In a separate encounter during this same window, a county deputy pulled McCroskey over while he was driving a car that belonged to the Niederbrock family. He had no license. He was ticketed and released. The car had not been reported stolen because there was no one left alive in that house to report it. The deputy let him go. McCroskey made a phone call during this period. The details of that call were introduced as evidence. He told the person on the other end of the line that he had just killed the people in the house. The person he called did not contact police. 4 people were already dead. Police had been to the address twice. A deputy had pulled McCroskey over and let him go. A confession had been made by phone. And on September 18th, 2009, when police finally entered the house on 1st Avenue in Farmville, Virginia, they found Mark Niederbrock, Deborah Kelly, Emma Niederbrock, and Melanie Wells. The bodies had been there for days. Richard McCroskey was not in the house when police arrived on September 18th. He had already left Farmville. He took a cab to Richmond International Airport. He made his way into the terminal and found a place to sit in the baggage claim area. He was planning to take a flight back to California, back to Castro Valley, back to his father's house, where he lived. He was 20 years old. He had killed 4 people in a house in Virginia, and he was sitting in an airport waiting for a flight home. When police arrested him on the morning of September 19th, he was asleep in the baggage claim. He had no prior criminal record. As officers led him from the airport, McCroskey spoke to reporters who were already gathered. He looked at them and said 4 words. "Jesus told me to do it." He said this walking out of an airport in handcuffs. Flat, without elaboration. 4 words, and then he was in the vehicle and the door was closed. Here is the part of this story that matters most. Not as a verdict on a music genre, not as a cultural argument about what kind of art is appropriate or dangerous, but as a specific, documented, verifiable fact about this specific man and what he had been broadcasting about himself for years. Richard McCroskey had posted his intentions publicly, on MySpace, on his personal website, in his music. In lyrics he wrote and recorded and uploaded for anyone who wanted to hear them. In My Dark Side, he rapped about the best feeling he got from watching someone take their last breath. He described killing people slowly. He described the specific physical sensation of it. He described stabbing and watching and the satisfaction of it. He put his name on it, his photograph, his location. In a video posted online, he held a hatchet and sang about killing people and putting their remains in black bags. He described what you do with the bodies before they start to decompose. He was not whispering this in private. He was not burying it in metaphor. He was rapping it, clearly, in his own voice, with his face in the frame. His friends knew about the music. People in the horrorcore community had heard it. His MySpace page was publicly accessible. And here is what every single person who encountered that music said afterward, when reporters called them looking for comment. They said they never thought he meant it. That is the door this story walks through. Not the violence itself. Violence happens, and crime happens, and people make terrible choices for reasons that are sometimes explicable and sometimes not. The door this story walks through is the one that most of us stand in front of every day without knowing it. The moment when someone tells you something true about who they are, and you decide, without quite deciding, that they cannot possibly mean it. That it is performance. That it is art. That nobody actually does the things they describe doing. That the person in front of you is not that person. Richard McCroskey was exactly that person. He had been that person, in writing, in his own voice, in public, for years. Dr. Deborah Kelly taught criminal justice and sociology at Longwood University. Her courses included classes on homicide, on victimization, on the human cost of violent crime, the people behind the statistics, the families, the ripple effects of a single act of violence through an entire community. She stressed to her students year after year that crime was not an abstraction, that the numbers in the textbooks were people, that understanding violence meant understanding the people it happened to. She had a student over to her house for a cookout the week before she died. She invited the young man her daughter knew from the internet to stay in her home. The woman who taught other people to see the human reality behind violent crime could not have known that the thing she spent her career studying was already inside her house. Sometimes the cruelest fact in a story is not the violence itself. It is the distance between what a person knew and what they could not have known in time. Richard McCroskey was charged with 6 counts of capital murder under Virginia law. He faced the death penalty. In September of 2010, 1 year after his arrest, McCroskey appeared in court and entered a guilty plea on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. His attorney, Carrie Bowen, spoke to reporters after the hearing. He said the prospect of the death penalty had been a significant factor in the decision to plead guilty. He said, with the directness of a man who had spent his career in courtrooms and had no reason to soften his language. 4 bodies are pretty compelling evidence. This is the kind of stuff that citizens any place in this country are terrified it could happen to them. This is the kind of case death penalties arise from. The families of the victims issued a written statement. They did not speak to reporters. They had sat in the courtroom and heard the plea, and they chose to say what they needed to say in writing. The statement read, in its entirety, "We have endured a tragedy of unspeakable proportions. We are relieved that justice has been done." McCroskey's own family did not attend the hearing. The community of Farmville held memorials for the 4 people who had been killed. The students at Longwood University gathered. The congregation of Walker's Presbyterian Church gathered. Emma's friends placed messages on a skateboard and a soccer ball at a service held in her memory. Melanie Wells was remembered in Inwood, West Virginia, where her family had moved just before she was to enter high school. Mark Niederbrock was eulogized as the man his congregation knew him to be, an Eagle Scout, a minister, a father who drove 4 hours when he could not reach his daughter. The question that the Farmville case left open, and it left several, but this one in particular, was the question of the music. Whether the lyrics constituted a warning, whether anyone who heard them bore responsibility for not taking them seriously, whether a genre built around violent fantasy had created an environment where a genuine statement of intent could be absorbed as performance and dismissed. The horrorcore community responded to the case with predictable defensiveness, and the defensiveness was not entirely without basis. Millions of people engage with violent art and violent music and violent fiction and do not commit violence. The vast majority of horrorcore artists and fans are not dangerous people. Art that explores darkness is not the same thing as darkness. And yet, Richard McCroskey described the act of killing with the specific personal enthusiasm of someone who had already thought about it extensively. Not the detached, theatrical violence of horror movie dialogue, not metaphor, not the alienated anger of someone venting in abstract. He described watching, waiting, the best feeling, his last breath. He was talking about a real experience he wanted to have. He had not had it yet, but he was describing it the way you describe something you are planning, not something you are imagining. The difference is there in the language if you listen for it. Think about what that means, practically. In a country where millions of people post dark, violent, confrontational content online every day, where rage and horror and explicit imagery are not the exception, but a significant portion of what circulates across every platform, there is an expectation, reasonable and, in most cases, accurate, that the content is not literal, that the person rapping about violence is not a violent person, that the person posting cemetery photographs is not a murderer. That dark art is dark art, and the person who makes it is probably someone processing their own interior world through an extreme creative lens. That expectation is almost always correct. Almost. The problem is that the exception to that rule looks, from the outside, identical to all the cases where the rule holds. McCroskey's music sounded like hundreds of other horrorcore tracks. His photographs looked like hundreds of other horrorcore photographs. His persona was built from the same elements that defined the genre's aesthetic. The community he was part of contained people who made the same kind of content and were not dangerous. From the outside, there was no obvious visual or auditory difference between Syko Sam and any other person in that world, except that there was a difference, and it was in the language, not in the subject matter. Violence is violence, and horror is horror, and the difference between a genre aesthetic and a genuine intention is not found in what the lyrics describe, but in how they describe it. The difference is in specificity, in the personal pronoun. in whether the violence is happening to a character in a song or whether the singer is describing, from a first-person perspective, what it feels like to do a thing they have imagined doing in particular physical detail. McCroskey's music sits on the second side of that line. People heard it and placed it on the first side because that is where almost everything else sits. Nobody listened for it. Richard McCroskey is currently serving 4 consecutive life sentences in a Virginia prison. He was 20 years old when he killed 4 people in a house in Farmville. He is in his mid-30s now. He will die in prison. Emma Niederbrock was 16. Melanie Wells was 18. Deborah Kelly was 53. Mark Niederbrock was 50. They died because a young man flew across the country to meet someone who did not feel about him the way he felt about her. Because he could not hold that information and remain himself. Because whatever was already inside him had been looking for a reason, and the reason arrived in a parking lot in Michigan when a 16-year-old girl looked at him and felt nothing. That is the full weight of it. Not a monster story, not a horror story in the genre sense. A story about a person who told everyone what he was capable of in the clearest possible terms, and was not believed until it was too late for 4 people who deserved better than what they got. There is a version of this story that ends with the music. The argument that horrorcore created something, that the genre warped a mind that might otherwise have bent differently, that if Richard McCroskey had grown up listening to something else, Emma Niederbrock would have lived to be 17, and then 18, and then older than that. That argument is probably wrong, or at least it is probably incomplete. People with the specific combination of grandiosity, entitlement, and incapacity for ordinary disappointment that McCroskey demonstrated do not need a musical genre to become dangerous. They need a reason. They find the reason, because they are looking for it. The music may have been a map, but he was already moving before he found the map. The version of this story that sits harder is the simpler one. He told people. He told them repeatedly, in his own voice, with his own name attached. He described what he wanted to do and how it would feel, and what he would do with the evidence afterward. He was 20 years old and living in California, and none of the people who heard his music and knew his name and saw his face on a MySpace page connected any of it to anything real. Maybe that is unfair. Maybe the gap between dark artistic expression and genuine dangerous intent is wide enough that crossing it without warning is genuinely unexpected. Maybe the people who heard Syko Sam's music and said he seemed like a nice kid offline were being honest. Maybe it is not reasonable to hold listeners and friends responsible for a level of interpretation that most people never need to make. But Emma Niederbrock is still dead. And Melanie Wells, and Deborah Kelly, and Mark Niederbrock, who drove 4 hours because his daughter was not answering her phone. The music is still online. You can find it if you look. The lyrics are still there. The voice is still the same voice. And now that you know what came after, the distance between the performance and the intention collapses entirely. He meant every word. The question this story leaves behind is not about music or the internet or the particular vulnerabilities of online relationships, though it is about all of those things. The question is smaller and more personal than that. It is this: how many times have you heard something that felt like a warning and decided it was probably just words? Most of the time, it is just words. Most of the time. These stories exist because someone decided they were worth telling, and they keep existing because people like you decide that they are worth sharing. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what we choose to hear and what we choose to dismiss, share it with one person today. Subscribe if you have not already. And leave a comment below telling me what you think. Should anyone have caught this sooner? Was there a moment in this story where you think it could have gone differently? I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.